Hi, everybody. My name is Jenny McLean, and I'm here to talk to you about environmental science today. If everyone wants to say hello and that you can hear me in the chat. Awesome. I'll go ahead and get my stuff pulled up here. Perfect. All right. All right, hopefully everyone is doing okay and enjoying the springtime warm weather. I'm definitely happy that it is not freezing cold anymore. I live up in Montana, so it has been really cold up until this week, but it's in the 60s today. So hopefully everyone got to enjoy some outside time today. I know that I did, so that's definitely helping with the being at home thing. All right, so today, whoa, pop back one. Today we are going to talk about human impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services, and how we find these different things in, oh gosh, bear with me, how we find these different services naturally occurring in the ecosystem, along with some examples of each and where they can be found. So if you are all ready, we are going to go ahead and just jump right into it. If you're not already following us on our social media sites, please do. It's a great way to keep in touch with other students, other teachers, and to keep in the know of what we're doing and what we're developing. We're coming up with some really cool summer programs right now, so make sure you're following us so that you can be the first to sign up for when we get our summer programs rolling shortly here. All right, so again, today we're going to talk about two major things, and those are biodiversity and ecosystem services. Introduction to biodiversity. I have a picture of a coral reef here because coral reefs are one of the most biodiverse ecosystems that can be found anywhere on the planet. They really have everything that organisms need to thrive. They have an availability of nutrients and sunlight and water, and that really leads to an explosion of life, not only in numbers, but in the different types of animals that are able to adapt and live there. And so that's one of our perfect examples of a highly biodiverse ecosystem is the coral reef. Okay, so let's start with some definitions and breaking things down. Biodiversity is the variety of life in a given habitat or ecosystem. So again, biodiversity is the variety of life in a given habitat or ecosystem. And if you break down the word biodiversity, it kind of lends you to that. Again, bio means life, and diversity is differences. So the different life in an ecosystem. And this isn't just animals, so this is going to be plants too. So all the different types of plants, funguses, bacteria, anything that's alive in an ecosystem is going to add up that biodiversity. So it can be looked at further in three ways. You can look at genetic, species, and habitat diversity. Genetic diversity is the total variety of alleles in a population that a population contains, or a range in genetic diversity within that population. And we'll take a second to think back, post in the chat. Do you remember what is an allele? I remember in bio, it's one of the things that people always have trouble really grasping. What is an allele? What does that mean? Don't be shy. There you go. Good job. A genetic trait. Exactly. An allele is a version of a gene. Yep, exactly. So an allele is a version of a gene, and that means that it is like a trait. So let's say if the gene for eye color, the alleles would be green, blue, brown, all those different colors. So those would be the alleles. So alleles, again, are different versions of a gene. And that gene could be for anything. It could be for tallness, or for an immune response, eye color, anything like that. So genetic diversity in a population is really looking at, are there a lot of differences? You know, does an animal, species of animal, do they all have brown eyes, every single one of them? Or are they more like humans, where some have brown eyes, some have very light brown eyes, some have very dark brown eyes, some have green, blue, and any variation in between. And that's a high amount of diversity in just that one gene. So if you think about how many different genes we have, having a very high genetic diversity would mean a lot of variation in everything. So every different possible combination that you can get in a species. Okay, so species diversity is the number of different species in a given community. So that first one was talking more about just one species and looking at its specific genes and diversity within that species. And then species diversity is looking at how many different species are living in one area together, or one greater area. If you're looking at like a big ecosystem or a big biome, how many are in that area? And so you can kind of define different areas differently, and then look at the diversity that's occurring within each one. And then lastly, we have habitat diversity, and that is a range of different habitats in a given region. Some places on Earth are pretty uniform. You know, you have massive grasslands. If you look at like the interior of the US, it's pretty much the same for a very long time. It's all grasslands. Deserts, there are some huge deserts in Africa where it's all the same habitat for a very, very long time. And then you have other places that have little tiny microhabitats that change very close to each other. So there are a lot of different diversity in a very close area that are very different. And then you have that, then you're going to have a lot of different possibilities for animals to adapt to different environments. So again, if you have like this large grassland that takes over thousands of square miles, animals are really all facing the same issues. And so they're going to really adapt to be the same type of animal in that area. A good example of the variation is just like in California in general, or especially in Southern California, you'll have very hot deserts and sandy deserts, and then chaparral, you'll have beach areas, forests and rainforests, as well as same as valleys and grasslands. So there's so many different ecosystems that are all in theoretically a space where an animal could walk from one to another. You read this question? Okay. Yep. Yeah. So it's just a summary, kind of what we're talking about. And it does, if you kind of look at it from genetic down to species down to habitat, it's going from like very narrow to much bigger. So your genetic diversity is going to be species. Then you're going to go into community, or I guess you can say population for the first one, population, community, and then ecosystem. So kind of that same progression from just the individual species, a community of species, and then a whole group of different ecosystems where an animal could walk from one to another one and experience different pressures. All right, let's keep moving. We're going to look at each one of these a little bit more specifically as we go along. So let's get a little bit more into that genetic diversity and what that means for a population and how it can impact them if they sort of lose that genetic diversity. So the greater the genetic diversity in a population, the better it can respond to environmental change by relying on different physical traits that are more advantageous. In other words, it can adapt. So if there's a population that is highly genetically diverse and something happens, there's a chance that some of those individuals will be able to deal with those pressures and are going to live. So let's say an example, if you look at these shells have all these different kind of colors, and that's just one phenotype for them. And let's say they're all on a beach and something happens and there's like a volcanic eruption that changes the majority of the sand to be a darker color. So now let's say now that sand is like mostly a dark black color. If you look at those shells, the one that's in like the upper left-hand corner, that one's going to be good to go. It's going to be hidden, whereas the bright kind of yellow ones are going to stand out. And that species, that type of organism is going to be able to survive because it had that diversity. If it was just, they were all yellow, they might be done for. They're going to be really easy for predators to find them. And so they're going to be easily eaten. But because they had that diversity and range in their species, they would be able to survive. So different things like that, they're going to be able to overcome. And it's really important that animals do have that genetic variation within their population. Genetic variation, remember, happens over time from mutations. So mutations don't happen very frequently. The majority of the time, when little babies are born, everything goes perfectly and they get the genetics that their parents had. But every once in a while, there are mutations. And sometimes the mutations cause the animal to not be able to live. So if it's a small enough mutation where it just makes it look a little bit different or have something just tiny bit different, where it can still survive in the current ecosystem and live to pass on that genetics, that's how you build over time genetic diversity. So as you can imagine, it takes thousands of years to build a species with a lot of genetic diversity so that when something bad happens, they are able to survive. So moving on to a bottleneck happens when you have a massive loss of genetic diversity. And naturally, that would happen, let's say, and go back to our shells example, let's say that volcano did explode and all of these shells in this picture and the ones that looked like them died, that had that phenotype. They could not survive, except for maybe those 3 in the upper left corner. So that is a bottleneck because all of the genetics that went with those other ones, those other individuals, are now gone. And just those few that were able to survive are going to pass on their genetics to the future. So it would be a massive loss of genetic diversity for that organism. And it would take a very long time for them to build that back up. And then that's an example of like something that would happen naturally. Again, like a new disease happens and it was able to take out the majority of those organisms. But what we've seen, like a kind of a better example of bottlenecking that we've seen is all of the organisms that we as humans have sort of driven to extinction. And that's all by hunting, habitat loss. These organisms their populations have crashed. And so the graph in the middle shows that, that population is very high. It's going pretty stable at its carrying capacity, and then it crashes and it either goes down to extinction or it begins to recover. And that's when a lot of times as humans, we try and intervene. And a lot of times if you look at these populations of animals that we're calling extinct and trying to save, the amount of the actual number of adult individuals that's left is just astronomically small. I don't want to get it wrong now. It's either 200 or 500 adult individuals that the IUCN says if it gets under that number, then we classify it as endangered. And there are a bunch of different classifications to be endangered. I believe there's 5. And if you have like 2, you can qualify faster. But if it's just on numbers alone, it has to be so small. I want to say it's 200. So if you look at that, you have 100 males and 100 females of, let's say, cheetahs. Well, that's such a tiny population to try and rebuild what it used to be, hundreds and thousands of, that you're going to have genetic bottleneck. And those organisms, after a few generations of trying to breed them in zoos, they're all related. They all, have the same genes. So you're going to have such a high potential for mutations or defects that are going to hurt that population. Just in general, then they would be very weak or susceptible to disease or to another disaster, but they probably wouldn't face another disaster if they were like in zoos. We use the cheetah example. The majority of cheetahs are like in zoos now. Same with like tigers. Those populations will never be what they were. Once we've driven an animal like pretty much to extinction, it's never going to be what it was. It would take thousands and thousands of years of subtle mutations to regain its strength as a species that would be able to withstand different environmental pressures. So it really is, they're very closely, I don't want to say like inbred, but they're very closely genetically related. And a lot of times they really are. So cheetahs, for example, I know that the reason they're having so much trouble rebuilding cheetah populations is because a large majority of the cheetahs who are in captivity that they're using to reproduce have a recessive trait for a sperm mutation. And so the sperm don't move. They don't go anywhere. Well, they just kind of spin in circles, I guess. But that's not going to function. It's not going to work. So those animals can't reproduce. And they are more likely to have two recessive alleles for that mutation now, because almost all of them have it, because of the population was so small, and the ones that did survive unfortunately had that mutation. So I know that that's a huge issue. In captivity, we can do in vitro fertilization, and we can kind of help things out. But again, like we're saying, they wouldn't survive in the wild if they couldn't breed on their own. So that's kind of, unfortunately, cheetahs are having a hard time because of that. And again, this is like a lot of other species. I think the black-footed ferret, they found 5 of them. And then they were already a family, and then they remade the population with those 5. So you can imagine the population or the genetic diversity in that population is really small, and the poor guys are really susceptible to diseases and genetic mutations. All right. Let's move on from genetic diversity, unless anyone has any questions about bottlenecking. I think cheetahs and black-footed ferrets are the usual go-to example for bottlenecking. So again, yeah, those are just really small populations whose genetic diversity is so low that they are more likely to have diseases. And so that's the same idea as inbreeding. Inbreeding is tends to indicate it was two that were directly related, like a brother and sister or something. So it doesn't have to be that directly related. It could be an organism and its second cousin, but still, they're very closely related. So their genes are very similar. Very high chance of having 2 recessive alleles for an allele, a trait that's going to kill them or cause them to not be able to reproduce naturally. And then, they're just not a viable example of their species anymore at that point. And then again, to increase genetic diversity, it just takes time, thousands and thousands of years of subtle mutations that are able to cause that animal to have more diversity in its gene pool. I had a question really quick, is that mules? Mules are a combination of a horse and a donkey. So same thing with horses and zebras or ligers. Those animals were able to be born. However, their genes they're not the same species. So their genes don't fully line up. And I don't want to say the wrong thing here, but they are what's the word for it? Sterile. So they can't reproduce on their own just because they are kind of this weird combination of 2 different species. It's kind of just a phenomenon that happens when, different species create something. Okay, so species diversity. So again, we're going from one species looking at its genetics, and now we're going to look at an ecosystem and the different animals that live within that ecosystem. So an ecosystem with a large number of different species are more likely to survive a disruption, with at least some of those species being able to adapt. So it's the same sort of concept. But now it's instead of just some individuals of a population surviving, some species would be able to survive. So sticking with the shell example, these are all those different seashells are different organisms. So those would be all different types of mollusks, different species that would live on in a beach together or in a coral reef. And if you have the same thing happen where a volcano, or let's say a coal plant, moved in and was putting a bunch of ash in the environment and it became very dark, if you look at those shells, all the ones that are very dark would have an advantage and live, and the ones that are very brightly colored would probably go extinct. And so that would change the species diversity in one ecosystem. And then species diversity too has to do with how many different organisms are living in one given area. So I put a roadrunner up there just because deserts have it's a very unique environment, and only a few types of organisms have adapted to live there and survive and do really well. So it's more limited. You have much less species diversity in a desert than you would in a forest that's sort of easier to live in. So you tend to see more highly adapted, specialized individuals and less of them. And then that equation, don't feel like you have to write it down or memorize it or anything like that. It's just good to know, have been able to see it. You may have done a lab in your class calculating diversity. So just to say that there is an equation that scientists use to look at different ecosystems, and you can calculate the diversity. And so once you have that index, you can compare ecosystems to each other. And they can be small ecosystems. You could say, what's that field over there? What's that species diversity looking at the plants versus the field over here? What's the species diversity there? And a lot of times they can make decisions for like construction based on things like that. If it's a highly diverse ecosystem, it's supporting a lot of different animals, a lot of different life, then maybe we'll decide to go build on a different ecosystem. So those decisions are sometimes used as well to decide environmentally what ecosystems should be protected. If it's someone that has very unique species found nowhere else, and a very high diversity of species, then maybe scientists would put a lot of effort into saving that ecosystem versus another one. So yeah, again, it's just good to know that there is an equation that they use to look at the species diversity index of a different environment. All right, and then finally, we're going to look at habitat diversity. And again, so this is like the biggest one, and this is the differences in habitats in like a given area. So the loss of different and unique habitats lead to the loss of specialist species that are adapted to live in a unique niche. That's our penguin. So some species can only live in one very special area. Another really good example of that is walruses. Walruses have to live on sea ice, and they have to live in very cold areas. They can't just decide, oh, I'm going to swim south for a while or go to a different warmer tropical beach. They wouldn't survive. So they have to live in a very specialized area. And you might remember the opposite of a specialist species is a generalist. And a generalist is a species that's really good at adapting to different areas. So it'd be like a pigeon or a raccoon. They can live in a whole bunch of different areas. They can eat a bunch of different things. They don't mind different temperatures. So that's kind of the difference between those two vocabulary words and where that they can live. So continued loss of habitat will then cause loss of generalist species, particularly impacting species that require large territories or the ability to move from one area to another. So organisms, let's say like a ground squirrel that doesn't ever go more than 10 feet from its hole, you could destroy all the habitat around it. And if there's one plot of land that's still natural habitat and it's got its little hole there, it can do its thing, he's good to go. Like he doesn't really mind that he's surrounded by roads, right? Again, he would be genetically isolated in there, but that species is going to be able to survive, having his habitat kind of isolated. Whereas an organism that's very large or needs to move around a lot is going to be impacted by that and impacted by humans building roads and cities and different things. And that's why I put the elephant picture on there. Elephants are known for their migrations. They travel in the exact same route every single year as they do these massive loops. So much so that they will just like walk straight through a city or a town that's been built because this is the path I've always taken. Like they won't go around. And they're also huge and just kind of like not afraid. But so that animal is often in conflict with people who don't want it walking through their neighborhood. And it can't survive just staying still. It has to constantly move following the reins and grass, or it's going to starve. So that's some different impacts that animals have with the loss of habitats, or even with the like fragmentation of habitats. Yeah, exactly. Generalists are often invasive species as well, because they can live pretty much anywhere. If you took a penguin and you released it in Southern California, it's probably not going to survive. But if you took a good example, like a rat, and released it, it's going to do great. You know, it's going to have everything it needs to survive there. Yeah, exactly. So any an animal that's a generalist, if you were to move it, and humans often move them accidentally in our boats or shipping, or sometimes on purpose. There's like great historical accounts of people being like, oh, I have a great idea on how to control bug population. Let's release cane toads. And then cane toads are like massive invasive species in Australia. So definitely organisms that are really good at living in different environments are ready to go to be invasive species. All right, so our habitat diversity. Okay, and the last one we're going to look at is species richness. Species richness is the number of different species found in a given ecosystem. And this is a count of the number of different species, and not considering the abundance of each species or the abundance of each species' relation to each other. So it might be like, what are you talking about? But when you're looking at, so like, let's go back a second here. When we're looking at species diversity, it matters how much there are of each one. Let's use an example. Let's say we have a field, and in that field, there are 100 bison and 1 pronghorn and 1 jackrabbit. And so if you just looked at the different number of species, you'd be like, well, there's 3. But if you were looking at it more closely, analyzing it, looking at it more for this index number, you would say like, yeah, it's pretty much just bison. Like there's like 1 of those other ones. So it's really just mostly bison. And that's why this other number is different, species richness. You would just say 3. There are 3 different species. So it's kind of simplifying it a little bit and not looking at it as far as like how many there are, because it does matter when you look at it that way. Again, like if it was a marine ecosystem and you had 10,000 salmon and 1 tuna, you could say 2, but that wouldn't really make sense because it's really just salmon. So anyway, species richness is just looking at the specific number of those different species in that area. And so if we look at some of these different maps, they're kind of cool. It's showing us like where these different numbers of different species occur. So if you let's just look at the top left one, that's all birds everywhere. And the red and yellow is going to be like a lot of different species, whereas the blue is going to be not a lot. So you can see the Amazon has a ton of different bird species living in that area. And this is kind of a cool way to look at it, because you can say like there's different species there, where if you looked at like North America might have more birds overall, but they're all Canadian goose. So it's like kind of a different way to look at the different numbers of organisms. Same thing with mammals. A general trend for ecosystem, what's going to make them have more diversity or a higher richness is going to be what you need in an ecosystem, right? So you've got to have a lot of sunlight. So that's the equator, around the equator. And you're going to need water. You're going to need a lot of water and sunlight for those organisms to live. And even temperatures are easier for organisms to live in. So right around that equatorial band is where you're going to have the greatest diversity of different species and the less like specialists. So if you look at like way up in the Arctic, you're just going to have like a few specialist species who are able to survive in those areas and less numbers overall. All right, any questions about species richness? Where those occur? That looks good. Okay, so then we're going to jump into the second half of what we were going to talk about, and that is ecosystem services. And I think the bee is the biggest example of ecosystem services. And we'll talk about that more specifically. But again, an ecosystem service is like things that happen for free for us humans, and pollination is one of the biggest, most important ones. So ecosystem services, there are 4 categories of ecosystem services: provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting. And again, an ecosystem service, just really in general, is going to be anything that the environment, animals, the earth does for humans that is advantageous for us, that helps us, and it's free, and we would be really hurting if it didn't do it. So that's kind of like anything in that category. And when you really start to think about it and break down what those things could be, there's a lot. So that's kind of why there's 4 categories. Okay, so the first one is provisioning or provisions, and that's ecosystem goods. So things that we get from the ecosystem. The first one is food. We get all of our food from the ecosystem, and that could be wild. So like fish is a really good example. The majority of fish that we eat is wild caught, as well as if anyone out there is a hunter and you are getting deer and turkey and all that kind of stuff too. But our animals, so our food that we farm is also coming from the ecosystem. So they're eating food that we are able to grow with the ecosystem, and then we are able to grow those animals and get food that way. So all food in any really capacity here is an ecosystem service. Energy sources is going to be biomass and hydropower are free ways for us to get energy from the earth. So biomass is going to be like wood, cutting down wood for your fire, keep your house warm. That's free. It's the earth grows it for us, and we can stay warm that way. That's an ecosystem service. And then different materials, fertilizer, wood for building our houses, and that kind of stuff. Those are all going to fall under provisions. So anything that any product that we get from the earth. All right, the next one is regulating. So this is going to be waste decomposition, water purification, and pest and disease control. Starting with the first one, waste decomposition. Any organic material is naturally going to return to the earth as its organic components, as fertilizer, and it's going to help things regrow, which is awesome. If it didn't, then we would just have dead things lying around all over the place, and they would never change or go away. So that service is really cool that the earth does that for us. If not, there would just be piles of stuff everywhere, and the soil would run out of nutrients and we wouldn't grow anything else. So that's really neat that happens. And for the most part, that's just our strategy for getting rid of trash. We just bury it and hope that the earth sort of takes it back, figures out what to do with it. The next one is water purification. So water naturally gets purified to the point where it's good to drink just in the earth. And so those are the natural aquifers in the earth. The fact that it is built up of sand and clay, and as the water goes through there, it's going to pull out any bacteria, viruses, coccidia, anything that could be bad for us to drink, and you can just drink it. So if you have a well, you can just pull water straight out of the earth and be able to drink it just fine. And I know the majority of us are on city water, not on well water. But that same thing, a lot of that city water is pulled from aquifers, and it's good and wonderful and healthy to drink. A lot of times when it has to travel long distances, let's say in like an aqueduct in California, then they do go ahead and purify it again. But water straight out of the earth is good to drink. If it's sitting in like a river or a pond, then it's not, because it is exposed to organisms and bird poo and different things that could have effects on people. So that water is no longer clean. But straight out of the earth, like a survival method, if you're trying to survive, you don't have any water, if you just dig a deep enough hole till you get to the water table and water seeps up and into it, you can just drink that completely fine. So looking at pest and disease control, Any time that a organism is going to naturally get rid of undesirable organisms, then that's gonna fit into this category. So they would have to be getting rid of like an undesirable. That's why I put a ladybug. Ladybugs eat aphids, and aphids are teeny tiny green parasitic insects that live on plants, and they suck the sap out of the plant. And they'll kill it. They'll kill the plant over time. And there's just like tons of them on there, and the farmers hate them. And they're really difficult to get rid of. So one strategy would be spraying the entire plant down with poison to kill them all. But then your plant and your tomatoes are covered in poison, so that's not great. But ladybugs naturally eat them. Ladybugs are predatory insects, and so they are this wonderful pest control for us. So very frequently farmers or backyard gardeners will release a ton of ladybugs, and then they'll just take care of the problem, and they're cute and it works out great. Same thing with praying mantis. If you go to like Lowe's or any garden center, you can buy them like a praying mantis, and then you can release it in your garden in your backyard, and they're like really avid hunters. So it'll kill spiders, it'll kill all sorts of stuff in your backyard. And hopefully if it's a good environment, he'll just stay, and it'll be a free way for you to control pests organically. So that's pest and disease control that is naturally happening already for us, and we're really thankful for. And the next one, it kind of seems like intuitive, like you already know it, but maybe we just don't think about it all the time. As culturally, what we get out of the environment or ecosystems is it's really pretty, and everyone likes to look at it. Even if you're not like an outdoorsy person, you don't like hiking, you don't like the bugs and the sunburn, that's fine, I get it. But everybody likes to look at a picture of the environment. There's something about it, the blue and the green, it just makes us feel calm and happy, and it's nice. And that's something that we don't want to take for granted, because if we destroy it all, then we won't be able to have that to go look at and see. If we pollute the waterways and cut down all the trees and get smog in the air, and then that's just what we're stuck with, it tends to make us sad. We don't like it. So here's a picture of a city with smog. It's like gray and sad looking and not great. So that's something too, just the cultural benefit of having clean, preserved open spaces is really good. It's really big, and it's important for us to maintain those. So we'll go back to our pretty green scape before we move on. All right, and so the last one, supporting, this is probably what you're more familiar with when thinking about ecosystem services, and this is that bringing back the bee for pollination. So pollination, soil formation, nutrient cycling, and primary production. Pollination and the bee, again, is the biggest example of an ecosystem service because it's really important right now in the news. Basically, a short timeline of what happened is people learned to farm. We brought all of these plants that were the exact same together, and pests like aphids and different beetles were like, oh, this is awesome. This is my favorite food. And you put a whole field of them together for me. This is great. We'll eat all of these plants and reproduce a ton. And it's awesome. And then farmers and people consuming those plants were like, oh, wait, we don't want these bugs here. This isn't great. And now there's like a ton of them because we have all the same plants in the same area. And what do we do? And then we came up with the idea of, let's spray bug spray. Let's kill all the bugs on the plants. And, there's the added effect that then we're eating those poisons, but that's not exactly what we're talking about here. So we sprayed like just a general, let's just kill all the bugs in the field. Let's have no bugs in this entire field. Just get rid of all of them. So we sprayed like really strong pesticides and insecticides specifically on our plants. We've been doing it for years and years, hundreds of years. And what we started to realize is, well, when we spray this poison, it kills all the bugs, including the bees. And that's a problem because the bees are what's pollinating. And any plant that has a fruit is going to have a flower that created that fruit. So those are called angiosperms. And it's a type of plant that evolved with bees. They evolved together. And so those angiosperms are going to have a flower, and then a bee is going to come and pollinate it, which means that it's going to take pollen from one flower to another flower so that it can start reproduction for it, because they can't reproduce on their own. Other types of plants that are not angiosperms rely on the wind or water, or like some of them catch burrs in your dog's fur and rely on that to move things around. But angiosperms specifically, so again, this is anything with a flower, requires an insect or a specialized sort of mammal. Sometimes it's bats, but for the most part, it's bees that they require to come over and visit their flower in order for them to reproduce. And their reproduction, their baby, is a fruit. And that's what we really like to eat. So if we killed all the bees, there's no fruit. So think about like literally every flower, every fruit that we could eat, anything that you can think of, like watermelon, blueberries, apples, oranges, any of those things, we wouldn't have anymore, which is a crazy amount of food that we eat that we wouldn't have. So we really need bees. We need to rethink what we're doing so we don't kill them. And they are endangered. We really did a bad job. And so bringing those populations back is really important. And making something organic means that you don't spray any pesticides on it. You use only organic fertilizer. So you wouldn't use any sort of synthetic fertilizer. You would use like cow poop, so things that are from the earth, not chemicals. And organic in the definition itself is really hard to find right now. As far as some companies can say, oh, this is organic. And that might mean something different from what you think or what another company is saying. So it's sort of a term that is loosely defined right now, and sort of depends. You'd have to look further into what you were purchasing. But for the most part, it means no synthetics. So can't spray Roundup on it. You can't use synthetic fertilizer. If it's an animal, you can't give it an antibiotic. You have to use natural remedies. But yeah, so pesticides are bad for us. As a comment, that it's poison, but it's poison designed to kill a very small animal like a bee, not a large animal. But yeah, it is, at the end of the day, it's poison that we're spraying on the plants to keep the bugs off of it, and then eating that. So that's the difference between organic and not. But yeah, so think about like what it would cost, just like in a monetary number, if we had to pay a person to run around with like a Q-tip and touch every flower on one tree and then another tree to do what bees do. It would be astronomical. Like we couldn't even afford to have fruit. Like a blueberry would be $20 each just to have someone sit there and do that. It wouldn't work. So we need bees. We need to rethink what we're doing to keep them. Soil formation, same thing. Soil naturally is created from decomposition of organic matter. And if we had to try and like make soil somehow in a science lab, that would be crazy. It would be really expensive and hard to do. And so it's something we really need to preserve. A lot of times soils are wasted when we clear cut forests or remove plants, and then it rains and all the soil washes away into a waterway and ends up in the ocean, and then it's gone and we don't have it and we can't grow plants with it. So that's something we need to be really careful about. It's been a huge issue in the farming communities surrounding the Mississippi River, is the runoff there. And there's, we don't have to get too far into it now, but there's different things that they do, like no-till farming. So like don't dig up the soil to prevent it from washing away when it rains, because soil is really valuable. If it's gone, it's gone. There's nowhere like else to get it. It takes forever to make. You have to have plants decomposing, and it's really valuable. Definitely understand if you live somewhere that doesn't have soil, if you live somewhere that's like a desert and your yard is just rocks, like there's no soil and it's not going to just appear. So places that have it is very special. And then the last one, primary production. All of our food, starting from plants, is made from plants. Like whether you're eating a tomato or a leaf, like lettuce, or you're eating a steak that cow ate grain, all of our food comes from plants. So that is just really amazing. And it's awesome that plants exist and that we've evolved with them to eat them. And that we have that service for them, for us. But that's not one that's like as impacted as something more specific like bees. All right, and so let's look, we kind of already went through this as we were talking, but let's look a little bit more at human impact. Humans disrupt these ecosystem services and then pay the price. And so again, the bees is the perfect example of how we made a terrible mistake, and now we are trying to figure out how to reverse it before we lose all of the bees. And people farm bees. There are bee farmers that have bees, and they have like whole businesses where they have their bee hives and they drive them around the country to different farms when the plants are flowering. So you could have like your army of bees, and then you drive them to California for almond season, and then you drive them to Texas for, a cotton season, or, you just like move them all around. So there are farmers who do that, and their animal is their bees. Anyways, another few that I put on here that are really good examples that you might see come up is just fish in general. So much food comes out of the ocean. The ocean is crazy at how many humans it can support with food. So whether that's fish or shrimp or seaweed, the ocean is just like this massive production. But we kind of went crazy. We were kind of like, oh, it like produces so much fish. Let's just like scoop out all the fish and then pick out this one that's like, we really like it. And then we'll just like kill the other ones. And over time, that caused a crash of fish populations. And that the technical term for what I mentioned is bycatch. And so that's, you just like catch everything, you pick out the ones you want, throw the other ones back. And that's what we did for a really long time and are still doing. And just over harvesting of fish. We take too many too fast. They don't ever get to grow up to be adults or reproduce, and we crash the populations. And just like what we talked about before, they lose their genetic diversity. They're not able to regrow. And we are losing that resource that we had of fish. And another really great one, another really easy to see example is mangroves. So that picture in the middle those are trees. So it kind of is cut off, but at the top you'd see a lot of leaves. And mangrove trees are really unique. They're one of the only vascular plants that can live like in the ocean. And in this picture, the tide is out, so they are on land, but when tide comes back in, they will be submerged in ocean water, which is a very harsh environment. And they have these really cool roots that go like deep underground, and then they come up and then deep underground. And it kind of creates this net that holds the sand in place. Mangroves they're just like right on the beach in estuaries, and they're so tough because they're all intertwined. Like every plant is intertwined with each other. And they can, like if a hurricane comes in, they'll slow the waves down. So there's no damage to the land. You don't have the sand running away. They're really adapted to being able to slow down waves and make that cushion. Well, humans also like to live on the beach. So we, in a lot of cases, we're like, oh, let's get these terrible trees out here. We can't sit on the beach if there are these trees here. So we just like cut them all down and we built houses, and it looked great. And then a hurricane came and the sand gets washed away and the water comes up onto the land, and it's really disastrous. And so the mangroves are a really good example of it was doing something really cool. It was keeping this ecosystem preserved, and we just kind of took them out of there and then face the consequences of removing those. All right, I think that is it for what we were going to talk about. And then I have some example questions for us for what you might see on the exam. These are just some pieces of old FRQs. All right, so in the chat, please respond. Describe 2 ecosystem services provided for humans by forests. So let's just break that part down now. So think about a forest. What are two things that a forest does for humans? Give you a second to answer. Anything that we can get out of or enjoy from a forest. So some of the things, let's see. That was a perfect response. So we got one that says tree roots purify water, and culturally humans enjoy taking hikes. The second one, it references specifically like that it's a cultural service, and that's like perfect. That would have been like checked off on the test. For the other one, the tree roots are going to hold soil in place to preserve the soil. And then that soil is going to be able to purify the water. So just clarifying a little bit more as to what exactly is going on there. It's right, but like, why is it right? Perfect. Yeah, trees are used for lumber for our houses. They provide warmth, which is fuel to be able to be burned. And again, on the exam, you're going to want to really clarify how it's doing it. So if you're going to say that trees provide us with warmth, how? Like the burning of lumber from trees from the forest are going to provide us with warmth. On the test, they would literally take it very literal. So there's a tree provide you with warmth, like if you hugged it. You know, what would you have to do to get the warmth out of it? So just try and write as much as you can, as very descriptive as you can, specifically. And then provisionally, a forest is going to be able to provide food. Perfect. Animals can be hunted. And like you can find mushrooms, different things in the forest. Excellent. Those are all great examples. Excuse me. So explain how clear cutting would affect each ecosystem service you described. So clear cutting is the act of taking out the entirety of the trees in a given area. Typically before they clear cut, they will have like a plane. I don't know if you've ever seen the planes that do the spray pesticides. So they fly really low and they like spray poison. They do that too. So they'll fly over the forest really low and they'll spray poison. And that poison is designed to kill all of the little plants, all the bushes and stuff like that. And then they'll wait a while. I don't know how long, a week or a month, for those plants to kind of like die down. Makes it a lot easier to get people and machines in the forest if all of that stuff is gone. Then they come in and they'll cut down every single tree in an area, like completely gone. The soil is all disrupted. There's not a living plant in that area when they're done. So that's clear cutting. How would that affect the ecosystem services that you described? Awesome. Someone said it's going to cause erosion of the soil. Right on. Perfect. The loss of tree roots is going to cause erosion of soil, or soil to erode into the waterways. That's perfect. If soil erodes into the waterways, you're not going to have that forest grow back. It's going to be permanently damaged. Let's see what else we got. Habitat's going to be destructed. Perfect. All of the organisms that lived there before are no longer going to be able to live there, like completely gone. Everything's gone. So yeah, their habitat, their food, all of that is going to be affected. It doesn't look pretty. It's absolutely right. It looks like a scar on the landscape, and it takes a really long time for it to come back. So all of those answers were really good. Right on. Those are all examples that were given it on the test as correct answers. So that looks great. All right, so let's do another one here. Describe two characteristics shared by an ecosystem that has high biodiversity. And I thought this was a really good question to put on here because I felt like it was a trick question. Ooh, there's another good answer. There would be no air purification. So like, also on the test, if it has a question like that with two parts, let's go back. You have to answer your own thing. So like if you said, Describe 2 ecosystem services provided for humans by the forest. So let's say you said erosion and culturally people like to hike, and then explain how clear cutting would affect the services you described. If you then said there wouldn't be any more oxygen produced by those trees, you're not going to get points for that. You're right. You said correct facts, but you didn't address your 2 things that you said. So make sure that you're always like answering the same thing that you said. So what were the 2? It was erosion and hiking. So we say like the soil is going to erode, and then it's going to cause it to not have primaries. It's not going to have secondary succession and come back in a timely manner. And humans are going to no longer have that activity that they can enjoy. So you'd have to answer your own too. You guys probably knew that, but just be careful of that on the test. So make sure that you are reading that and doing the same, answering the same things that you posed. Yeah, because you could say right things, like you could say correct facts, but if they weren't like addressing your own things that you said, then yeah. Okay. Describe 2 characteristics shared by ecosystems that have a high biodiversity. So what are 2 things that have high biodiversity? So again, we looked at all the different types of biodiversity, right? Ooh, good job, Tammy. So when I first read this question, my first thought was, oh, an ecosystem that's going to have high biodiversity is going to have sunlight, water, be even temperature, right? Like that would be conducive to having a high biodiversity. But when I was looking at the answers that College Board was looking for on this, they were looking at like what would classify an ecosystem as having a high biodiversity. So that wording to me, I felt like was kind of a trick question. So what would classify it as having a high biodiversity? And that would be a large different number of different species. You could say a large genetic pool, high genetic diversity within species. Yes. Yeah, so I was reading Tanya's response. So yeah, high species richness and a high species evenness. So I felt like that was an interesting question because sometimes I know how I take tests and I read really fast. I'm like, oh, I know this one. But definitely take a second to slow down. What is it asking? Yep, take a second to slow down and really look at what it's asking. Because this one I feel like is a perfect example of that. Describe one naturally occurring factor that could lead to loss of biodiversity. Yep, good answers. Our answers are introduction of an invasive species or a new consumer, forest fires, natural disasters, volcanoes. Yep, disease too. If there was a naturally occurring disease that was going to anything that's going to cause that population to crash and bring that down, either a population or a community. So either one there. Awesome. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Unfortunately, I do have to run, but I think that was really great. And I think your answers are spot on as far as, what could come up on an exam. And at the end of the course, typically we talk about human impact on biodiversity. I know that that was cut off from the course this year, but that's something that's really interesting to look at. It does really pertain. So I would take a look at that too. All right, everyone, thank you for joining, and we'll see you next time.